The Seventh-day Adventist Church in Ontario today has a membership of about 35,000, with 132 churches stretching across the province. But only 130 years ago, there were a mere handful of believers, no churches, and few in Ontario who had ever heard of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As we search the historical records, we find that the Adventist Church in Ontario largely had its origins in the southwestern district, in an area stretching from Windsor to Woodstock and from Sarnia to the north shore of Lake Erie. This is the story of our beginning. The earliest records of the work of the Adventist in Ontario appears to have begun in 1852, when Joseph Bates and Hiram Edson, who had been prominent leaders in the Millerite movement in the early 1840s, made a trip along the south shore of Lake Ontario, looking for Second Adventist, quote, end quote, a name given to those who years earlier had been adherents to the movement. We need to remember that there was no formal Seventh-day Adventist church at this time, as the church would not actually be organized till 1863 in Battle Creek, Michigan. Ontario was referred to as Canada West, as Confederation would not occur for another 15 years. Yet, there were a handful of scattered believers and some Sabbath keepers across the province. In 1851, Peter Gibson and his wife of London, as well as a few others, confirmed their adherence to the Advent message.
If any of the brethren of the Philadelphia church are going to the West this summer, I wish them to give me a call. The Review and Herald is a great comfort to me, as I am all alone in this part of the world. Peter Gibson, May 19th, 1851.
For the next 40 years, an occasional evangelist would come to Ontario and make a few converts here and there, but it was very sporadic. In 1876, 5 people were baptized in Lake Huron as a result of meetings in Lambton County, in the town of Wyoming, near Sarnia, and the first congregation was formed with 8 members. In 1879, evangelist John Fulton located in Chatham and reported that 36 people had begun to keep the Sabbath as a result of his meetings. However, when A.C. Boudreau revisited Chatham only 4 years later, he could not find a single one remaining of those 36 people. By the end of the 1880s, the Adventist church leadership in the U.S. began to realize that although they were seeing great growth of the church in the United States and other areas of the world, they had done very little in Ontario, right across the border. They came to the conclusion that it was time to begin a strong effort. It was decided to send evangelists into Ontario over the next few years, a few in the Toronto and Ottawa areas, and 4 in southwestern Ontario. They were motivated in part by a letter they received from a lady in Roscommon, Ontario. Roscommon was a small village just south of Bell River and on the outskirts of Windsor. In 1884, Emily Smith, a widow, went to visit her daughter in Michigan. While there, she attended some Adventist meetings, and returning to Roscommon, she brought back a few books and literature. She accepted the message and began to share her beliefs with her family and with neighbors, although meeting considerable resistance at first. In 1891, she sent a letter to the president of the Michigan Conference requesting that an evangelist be sent. In response to this request, early in 1892, Elder Eugene Leland arrived in Roscommon to begin a series of meetings, and at least 6 people committed themselves as Sabbath keepers as a result. Emily Smith had worked tirelessly to prepare people with Bible truth, and several people were now ready to join the movement because of her efforts.
I came to Roscommon Station and began a series of meetings in a hall. It was evident from the start that the Lord had work to be done here. One man paid for the hall 4 weeks in advance, and another one furnished fuel and lights. The favorable condition of the work at this place is due largely to a widow who accepted the truth several years ago from reading In spite of strong opposition from her own children, as well as from others, she has faithfully held up the standard of truth, doing all she could to get the people to read, purchasing books, loaning them about the neighborhood. The seed has thus been planted and is now bearing its fruit. Eugene Leland, March 22, 1892.
Leland was joined in the work at this time by Elder Alfred Burrell. The two men moved on to do more meetings in the community of Woodsley, and then were invited to set up their tent on a farmer's property in a small village known as Albuna, just north of present-day Leamington. In those days, and especially in rural areas, a series of tent meetings was a big event, and it attracted people from across the region. In fact, Elder Burrell, in a report back to Review magazine in Michigan, stated that over a 3-month period, approximately 4,000 different persons had attended at least one meeting, an amazing number considering that the entire population of Essex County, including Windsor, was only 15,000. One of the early converts, a lady named Sarah Carter, owned a farm nearby and offered to donate a portion of her land for the construction of a church. Fundraising began immediately, and the church construction began on a small piece of land surrounded by a grove of chestnut trees along a country lane in Albuna. When the people attending the Michigan camp meeting in Lansing that summer heard of the project, they raised and donated $240 and sent it to Albuna. The church built was 24 feet wide by 38 feet deep and was built in only 7 weeks. A horse barn was also built, 22 foot wide and 90 feet long. The entire project cost less than $1,000, and they actually raised more than this and were able to send back a donation to the Michigan Conference. The Albuna Church was the first Seventh-day Adventist church built in all of Ontario.
It was the first general meeting ever held in the province of Ontario for our people. For 15 years we have been trying to get a start in this province so that we could organize a church. Many times our brethren have said, could we get but one church, the work would go forward. But not until the present time has there been a sufficient number near enough together that would warrant the organization of a church. Alfred Bureau, June 18, 1893.
The corner of this farmer's field is the place where the church once stood. Eugene Leland then left to work in another area of Kent County, and Elder Burrell was joined in the work at Albuna. The evangelist often traveled by bicycle down the country roads from one place to another, looking for new places to begin an effort. One can only imagine the difficulty of bicycling down dirt or clay roads during the periods of heavy rain. In the spring, Alfred Burrell and Peter Howe were traveling by bicycle along a country road looking for new opportunities to raise their tents. They moved into Kent County, and near the village of Selton, halfway between Chatham and Ridgetown, one of their bicycles broke down in front of a farmer's property. The farmer offered to fix the bicycle for them, and while they were conversing, they discovered that the farmer was the brother of one of the recent converts in Albuna. As a result of this, the farmer invited the two evangelists to set up their meeting tent near the road on part of his farm property. The meetings were very successful, and soon they were building another church and barn in Selton, the exact same dimensions as had been built in Albuna.
Since my last report, the church building has been made ready for the masons. It is now more than 6 months since we put up our tent here. Nearly everyone at Albuna has sent us cash contributions, and Conrad Neester also came and worked upon the buildings for us nearly 6 weeks. From almost the first there has been a steady war against us, with the most unreasonable opposition. We expected prosecutions for Sunday labor, but there seems to be a power that has held all opposing forces at bay. Alfred Bureau, January 19th, 1895.
So the Selton Church was the second built in all of Ontario in the summer of 1894. Selton also has the distinction of being the first church school in all of Ontario. While the Selton Church was under construction, Elder Eugene Leland had been holding a series of meetings in a small community on the outskirts of Chatham called Darrell. Although no one was baptized that summer, the people asked that more meetings be held, and so the next summer Alfred Burrell and Peter Howe arrived in Darrell to begin another series. They were joined by another Michigan evangelist, a young trainee by the name of William Simpson. Once again, they had many converts, and so it was decided to build a church in Darrell, which was to be the third Ontario church building, constructed in 1895. In that year also, Eugene Leland had traveled to Toronto and organized a church there, but no church building was built. During the construction of the Darrell Church, the three men were seen working on the building on a Sunday and were charged for breaking the strict Sunday laws which were in place in Ontario at that time. The members of a nearby Methodist church made great efforts to bring the men before the courts and raised funds to assist in prosecuting them. The trial, held at Ridgetown, was a major event and garnered interest from many newspapers across North America, with articles appearing discussing religious liberty. The Sentinel magazine, which was a forerunner of today's Liberty magazine, devoted their entire monthly issue to the story. All three men were convicted and sentenced to serve time in the Chatham jail. Simpson used his time in jail to write a book on religious liberty, which was later published by the Adventist Church. After their release, they returned to complete the work on the Darrell Church, and it was dedicated near the end of 1896. With three churches now operating, a solid foundation for the work had been laid, and in Chatham, 2 years later, in 1897, the first Ontario Campmeeting was held. After the camp meeting, Howe and two other evangelists, Durland and Wellman, held tent meetings in Chatham and gained 10 new members. When the cold weather came, they rented a portable tabernacle to replace the tent at Grand Avenue near Thames Street. In 1899, a congregation was formally organized with 12 members. A year earlier, in 1898, the second camp meeting was held in St. Thomas, where there was only one believer and her 4 children. The camp meeting generated much community interest, and as a result, a church of 27 members was organized in that same year. One of the members, F.G. Hill, a contractor, would later play a leading role in erecting the original buildings of what is now Kingsway College. Also in 1898, in London, the First Adventist Church was organized in that city, and they also opened a health food factory. In 1899, the Third Ontario Camp Meeting was held in London at today's Western Fairgrounds, and that city became the birthplace of the Ontario Conference. The conference office was organized on June 15th and was located on Piccadilly Street, where this parking lot exists today. William Ward Simpson, who had served 40 days in the Chatham jail, was ordained to the ministry at the London Camp Meeting that summer. An elementary school was also opened in that year. In 1902, the members purchased their first church building at the corner of Oxford and Colborne Streets. By 1905, there were churches in London, Chatham, St. Thomas, Selton, and Albuna, and there were companies in Woodstock, Ingersoll, Oneida, Exeter, and Oil Springs. The Chatham Group erected a church building on McHugh Avenue in 1906. St. Thomas built a new church on Mary Street in 1909. In 1907, 2 of the London members financed a factory in the city, the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, opened by John Harvey Kellogg. And in 1910, his competitor, C.W. Post, opened a poster manufacturing factory in Windsor. In 1915, the first Windsor Church was organized, following an evangelism effort by Canadian evangelist Matt Allen. Windsor had a late start due to the fact that the few believers there had been worshiping with their brethren in Detroit. By 1915, southwestern Ontario had added 4 more churches: Windsor, Dresden, Petrolia, and Exeter. In Sarnia, a series of efforts were held in 1924, and a church with 14 members was organized, meeting in a chapel at 161 Victoria Street. Some of the other churches and companies in the district were not organized till years later. Woodstock in 1971, Leamington in 1977, North London in 1988, Windsor Spanish in 1990, Living Truth in London in 2015, and Living Faith in Windsor in 2015. In the early years, the Adventist Church was primarily composed of people of European descent. But as the 1960s dawned, changing Canadian immigration rules allowed for more people to arrive from diverse parts of the world, and the church very quickly became multicultural in nature. People brought with them the flavors of culture from their nations of origin. The early work of the evangelist in southern Ontario left a legacy which stirs the imagination. As a result of the Ridgetown trial of the three ministers, the issue of religious freedom and Sabbath worship came to the forefront in many areas of the continent. In fact, when the issue of Sunday laws later came up in the Canadian Parliament, a member of Parliament from Quebec stood up in the Assembly, and in a long speech he told the story of the Adventist ministers who were unjustly imprisoned for their faith. At another time, when further Sunday laws were being proposed in Parliament, Leland and Burrell were part of a four-man delegation sent by the Adventist Church to meet with Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier to plead the cause of religious liberty. The Sultan Church left a legacy through the members who formed that early church. They laid the groundwork for Adventist education in the province and produced leaders in the fields of education and administration.
As a result of the broken bicycle, there are now, or have been in the work of God, 1 doctor, 5 nurses, 1 conference president, 3 college professors, 1 school teacher, and 4 music teachers from this community. And so I think we can all say what I have often heard Pastor Burrell say: God bless the broken bicycle.
Relan Easter, early pioneer, Sultan Church member.
The Albiona Church members hold the distinction of building the first Ontario church. Most of those early members, including Emily Smith, are buried in the Albiona Cemetery awaiting the day when Jesus returns. None of those 3 early churches exist today, but they provided a foundation for the emergence of many other churches today in our province. Eugene Leland and Alfred Burrell both served in later years as presidents of the Ontario Conference. William Ward Simpson, after receiving most of his training in Ontario, later moved to California and became the premier evangelist for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in his day. His innovative use of illustrations and media served as the role model for future evangelism in the church. Southwestern Ontario churches have a rich history, and we today benefit from the labors and struggles of those early workers. They faced great opposition in trying to bring the Bible message to a country which itself was in its making, and we are indebted to those pioneers. May we be ready to continue the work and continue to be a part of this great story.